Hey everyone, welcome back to Tier Apologetics. So pumped you're joining us today. Today is the beginning of a new series. We're looking at influential philosophers, theologians, and more, and just kind of asking questions about what has influenced them. So, Dr. Hasker, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So, my first question for you, Dr. Hasker, is what led you into the world of philosophy?
I think I just had a natural interest in that direction as long as I can remember. Even when I was in high school, I didn't have any instruction in philosophy or any, sort of formal connection. But I read some philosophical books. Not saying what I made of them, but I've been interested in this from the word go. Really, seems to be, your mind just works along certain lines, and for me, philosophy is one of those areas. So more than most others.
So, you grew up just loving philosophy, but you're also known as one of the most influential Christian philosophers of this past generation, with everything you've done with the Trinity and open theism and whatnot. What's the story of Christianity and your faith? How did you become a Christian?
Well, there's nothing too dramatic about that. My parents were both very very sincere and devout Christians. In fact, they were missionaries in South America before I was born. They needed to return to the U.S., and it was through their influence that I was led to become a Christian. And since then, I guess I'd have to say there have been ups and downs, but there have been times when I felt very focused and very much drawn to trying to live and think a Christian faith as best it's possible for me to do. That's what I can say, I guess.
That's helpful. What about who are some of the people that have influenced you the most? Maybe you could think about in your own personal journey as a Christian and also as a philosopher. Who are some of the people that have influenced you the most?
Well, I was thinking of some philosophers who have affected me quite a bit. And one that I would have to mention first probably is Arthur Holmes, who's professor of philosophy at Wheaton College and really one of the great, let's say, Christian philosophical statesmen of the just past generation. I had several classes with Holmes, and I'd like to quote something that he said many years later. He said, I was, quote, the most anti-Calvinist Arminian vocally I think I ever had in class. By adding vocally, I think he meant that I had quite a bit to say about this. And undoubtedly I did. But he was a remarkable teacher and had a remarkable influence in the growth of Christian philosophy and Christian philosophers. I remember once he gave a chapel talk at Huntington College where I was teaching, and he spoke about in his mind seeing 100 Christian philosophers out in the profession and approaching the discipline of philosophy from a Christian viewpoint. He said, and then I see 200, and I sat there and not opposed to his thinking, but I thought, well, this is really pretty far-fetched stuff. But it turned out that it wasn't far-fetched.
Mm.
There are numerous Christian philosophers teaching both at Christian schools and at secular colleges and universities. And Arthur had an enormous influence in bringing that situation about. So he was certainly one prime influence. Another very important influence has to be Alvin Plantinga. I think that, Plantinga has done more than probably anyone else in sort of planting the flag of Christianity and showing that Christianity has a role in the philosophical world in a way that even philosophers who are very opposed to this have to acknowledge. And for me, a very important episode was in 1978. He had a National Endowment for the Humanities summer workshop at Calvin College, and I was pleased to be part of that. This, incidentally, was where 4 of us got together who eventually, some years later, published the textbook, Reason and Religious Belief, which has been, I have to say, quite influential and quite successful. Certainly one of the important textbooks in philosophy of religion for the last generation. There's one little incident. During the workshop on one day, Al took us all rock climbing. Plantinga is a rock climber and mountain climber, but he took us to a place in Michigan that offered some good opportunities. And it turns out I am the world's poorest rock climber. I've never been rock climbing except that one day. But it was one I was trying to climb a particular pitch, a particular bit of rock, and Al was holding the line that was going to hold me and catch me if I fell off, which was extremely likely. And so while I'm in this precarious situation, Al made the remark. He said, "I don't like what you said about my argument." I paper on the second ontological argument, which Al was for, and I was somewhat critical. So I said, "Well, if you let go of that rope, nobody will ever know about it." He didn't let go of the rope, and so the article was published. But no, Al is just, and I don't follow Alvin on all of his views by any means. I've criticized some of them, but I think he sort of laid down a marker and what he did could not be done by anyone else, I think, although there's some other very important Christian philosophers in that generation. But I think one of Al's strengths was he was completely unfazed by intellectual and philosophical fashions. That is, if most philosophers were thinking in a certain way, and Alvin thought that was nuts, he'd say, this doesn't work. He wasn't intimidated into going along with the mainstream, as many of us tend to do. And I think that was both a terrific example and allowed him to do things that have been important. So those are a couple. George Mavrodes of the University of Michigan was quite important. Before I wrote my book, God, Time, and Knowledge, of course, I was taking the open theist, developing the core ideas of an open theist position. And Mavrodes had his own approach, which he set out in a charming article. inventable? That's a rather odd question, right? But George had a terrific oddball sense of humor. He could see things in a different angle. But anyway, before I wrote the book, we had a very extensive correspondence. This was sent by snail mail in those days, before the days of email. But there were probably a couple hundred pages of that correspondence between us, and well, we didn't persuade each other, but this contributed a terrific amount to that book, which has been, has certainly established itself as at least a point of view, right? but George also was instrumental in getting me to become part of the Society for Philosophy of Religion, a group that meets in southern cities every spring. And he invited me there, and that's been a pretty important part of my philosophical life. So there certainly are a number of others. Eleanor Stump is someone whose influence I value, even though, again, we disagree about some things. Disagreeing about things is normal state of mind for philosophers. And yet, there are many our fellow Christian philosophers with whom I have a great deal in common, even though we do disagree about things. So it's the objective is not to be right about everything. The objective is to try to make progress, and there certainly are other people, Bob and Marilyn Adams, I have greatest admiration for. I've had a lot of interesting disagreements with Tom Flint, who's at Notre Dame. He, of course, is, I think, maybe the best exponent of Molinism or divine middle knowledge. And I've been one of his, I guess, thorns in the side or critics. Not that he would concede that I've made any dent in his views, but it's been very enjoyable. Dean Zimmerman, who's at Rutgers University, maybe I can claim to have influenced him a little bit, because he is an open theist and also an emergent dualist. But of course, he has great standing and respect in the philosophical community, and certainly among Christian philosophers. So there are numerous people that have had an effect.
That's awesome. Just one clarification. I think you broke up for a sec. What was the question that George asked you that really impacted you?
Well, it was George Mavrodis, you think about?
Yeah, you mentioned him for a little bit.
I think it's more his sticking up for his own, at the outset, it seems an incredible position, but he argues that I can now in the present do something that will prevent something from happening in the past. Okay, that sounds pretty bizarre. It involves it pretty clear, or seems to involve retroactive causation, that I can do now something that will keep something from happening in the past that otherwise might not have happened. And the most important example of that is I can prevent God from, in the past, having certain beliefs that he might otherwise have had. For instance, by talking with you this morning, I prevented God from thinking that I was mowing the grass this morning. Okay? If I hadn't been talking to you, I might have been mowing the grass, and God would have believed then in the past that I was going to mow the grass at this time. But by talking with you, I've prevented God from having that belief. Now, that's weird, right?
Yeah.
It's a little strange. But the thing is, he could make it, he did a lot to make it plausible, to make it believable that I might have this power. So I had to track him down and keep raising questions till I got to the point where at least I was satisfied that he couldn't make this work. But the work that I did in unraveling his position was important for my own understanding of the issue. So that's an example. That's one issue that I spent quite a bit of effort on, and he was kind enough to spend quite a bit of effort in showing me why I was wrong. So it was, for me anyhow, enormously valuable.
Yeah, that's super helpful. What are some of the like events that influence you the most, Dr. Hasker, besides for like obviously Alvin Plantinga not letting you fall rock climbing? That's obviously a big deal.
Yeah.
But like what events influenced you?
What has influenced me? Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose as far as my life as a philosopher, it's things that have happened that have affected the direction of my own philosophical work and activity. One thing that certainly affected me in important ways was getting turned down to become chair of philosophy at Wheaton College. When Arthur Holmes was getting ready to retire, they were looking for someone to, succeed him as chair of the philosophy department there, which was reasonably prestigious and certainly a strong department. And I was, I think, one of two candidates, along with Steve Evans, who is now, of course, at Baylor University, and also was a graduate from Wheaton. And I think at one point Steve had pretty well decided to drop out, and I was interviewed on campus, and the interview, everything seemed to be going very well, and I had a conversation with the president, I had a conversation with the dean. We were talking pretty seriously about possible, contract options and so on. The last event of the day was a meeting with a select committee of faculty who, I guess, always would meet with prospective future faculty and get to feel this out. And to my shock, they shot the whole thing down. I'm not sure, honestly, what the reason or main reason for this was one thing that struck me as rather strange is that some of the people in that group insisted on pursuing my stance on the issue of abortion, and I do not take a strict anti-abortion stance, but they were asking me what I thought was a completely unrealistic hypothesis. What if a woman student came to me and told me that she was pregnant and was considering whether or not to have an abortion? Well, first of all, I regard this as completely implausible. I guess I'm not the kind of person that students are likely to ask this kind of question of. But I refuse to give a categorical answer. And I think some of the members of the committee pursued this for quite a while, and eventually we just sort of let it drop. But I know that was in the minds of some of them. But then another issue was the attitude towards evolution. Now, Wheaton has, in its statement of faith, regrettably, in my opinion, but a statement that seems to preclude human evolution. That is, that humans are descendants of earlier apes. But I had been given the impression in my earlier discussions that there was some wiggle room on this, that this is not something that was, absolutely hard and fast. But I told the committee that I was, somewhat, certainly somewhat favorable towards evolutionary theories. And I think perhaps that may have been the sort of the official reason why this committee voted to block my appointment. And even though everything previous to this had seemed to be going very favorably. And later on, when I talked to the dean, she was also, I think, somewhat shocked at the result, but she said that she could not, although I guess she formally had the authority, but she could not overrule or go against the recommendation of this committee. And so my candidacy for that position disappeared. They eventually made an appointment from within the department. But so that was a real shock to me at the time. It's like you're halfway through the door and then it smashes against your face, being slammed. But I think in retrospectively, it's probably a very good thing for me in my career, because I've become much more emphatic in my advocacy for evolution, including the evolution of human beings. And I think this would have, even if they weren't too worried about my having this view, I think it would have become more and more of an obstacle and could have been a major problem. So I remained at Huntington College Huntington University for the rest of my teaching career. And the nice thing about Huntington University is that nobody gave me a hard time. I was really, I'm in agreement with the state university, but nobody came looking over my shoulder and saying, well, what if you say this, so and so and so and so. And it can be this kind of scrutiny can be really disruptive for Christian faculty members, as I've seen in certain cases. One that also was important, another similar case, John Sanders, who is one of the leading open theists. John came to join the Huntington faculty in the 1990s, and he came on board with full recognition by the president and faculty and so on that he was an advocate for open theism. Of course, I was also an advocate for open theism, but it doesn't matter so much with philosophers. Okay, people know that philosophers are a little bit crazy, so if they have some bizarre ideas, that doesn't rankle people's raise people's hackles quite so quickly. But for theology, it's different. As my friend Richard Rice said, the good thing about theology is that people really care about it. But he said then the bad thing about theology is that people really care about it. So, which is, if you're a theologian and are adopting views that some people regard as unacceptable, the red flags go up much quicker, much faster. And John made, I guess, from a tactical standpoint, the mistake of writing the book, The God Who Risks, which is, I think, still it's the best statement of the doctrine of divine providence from an open theist perspective. But by doing that, he became, I think, perhaps the major, most important spokesperson for open theism, and got a lot of people's attention, including some of the people in the supporting denomination. And they hounded John and hassled him and attacked him to the point where they eventually found a way to get him dismissed from the Huntington University faculty. And this really, I don't know if I'd say ruined his life, but it preoccupied him. It was a terrible burden on him for several years. He moved to Hendrix University in Arkansas and has had a very successful career there. But this was to me, a scar on the reputation and credibility of Huntington University, one that I still regret. And it altered my own relationship, because I had thought that we were a college that would honor the freedom of inquiry of Christian scholars, so long as we remained within the, let's say, the framework of faith set out in our statement of faith, which, by the way, had nothing in it that excludes open theism. But it turns out that I think this is true quite generally, in a denominational college, a college that is supported by a church, if there is a significant group of influential people within that church that takes exception to a particular faculty member or a particular viewpoint espoused by a faculty member, it's very difficult for the institution to hold the line on academic freedom and avoid an improper interference by members of the denomination. And that was certainly very, very evident in this case, but I know of other cases in which this has been true. So that was a series of events there that had an effect on me, on my thinking. It did not disrupt my own teaching or my own work, but it left a permanent taste in my mouth, shall we say. Okay, those are some major, of course, major events.
Yeah.
I think the 1916 U.S. presidential election was a major event for all of us in this country and affected my thinking in many ways. I was shocked and dismayed, and I'm still shocked and dismayed that many, in fact, the majority of those who term themselves evangelical Christians in this country, that is white evangelical Christians, are strong supporters of that man, perhaps his most loyal supporters anywhere. And it made me realize that I'm not really part of their community, even though I agree with many of their theological views, but I simply can't. I can't see it as being good for our country or good for the world or as consistent with basic Christian views and Christian values.
Which president are you referring to?
Donald Trump.
Oh, I thought you said 1960. I'm sorry, I was
1916. I'm sorry. Oh,
so
yeah. You can see which generation I'm part of. 2016.
My bad.
Oh my goodness. Sorry about that.
You're good.
Leading you in a completely weird direction. I'm sorry.
No, this is super helpful because people understand your story more as they listen to this. So yeah, I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, okay.
So if we're done with like some of the events that have influenced you the most, Dr. Hasker, what are some of the like books or articles, like what have you read that's influenced you the most?
Oh yeah, I was thinking about that. That's hard to answer. Looking at the overall viewpoint of philosophy, I think, of course, things like Plato's Republic, Augustine's Confessions was really important for me personally, even in my understanding, even though I disagree with some of Augustine's views, his determinism especially, but this had an important influence. Reading David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, a book that I disagree with very much, but laid out a certain way of approaching philosophy that is important to understand, I think. Of course, if you start with Hume and you have nothing or very little, then you can build up from there and hopefully end up with something substantial. Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations are certainly an important book, though I don't consider myself a Wittgensteinian. I guess I was more of one at this early stage, but I'm not a Wittgensteinian. One article that is rather key in my thinking, G.E. Moore has a paper entitled A Defense of Common Sense. And he begins with a whole series of simple and obvious truths about the world. He begins by saying the world has existed for many years past. You wouldn't think that's an important philosophical discovery, would you? But he gives this long series of truisms, and then he says, I believe that all of these things that I've said are wholly true. That is, he takes these common sense truths as having such innate, inherent credibility that that philosophical views that would undermine them have an enormous uphill battle to be accepted. And I think in this he was reflecting the views of the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Ross, but I think the element of common sense is something which should not be overlooked by philosophers, and often is. Then coming to some more recent books, let me see what I've got here. Yeah. Well, there's Alvin Plantinga's book, The Nature of Necessity. That set up a framework of thinking for Christian analytic philosophers that in many ways still remains there. That is, many people will take the basic assumptions about possible worlds, states of affairs, necessity and contingency, and so on. The basic framework that Plantinga set up there is in place still for many people. It was also a book in which he stated his rediscovery of divine middle knowledge, and incredibly influential, extremely influential. Then later on, the volume Faith and Rationality, edited by Plantinga and Nicholas Wolterstorff, which was some of the early important work setting out the basics of what is called Reformed epistemology. Alvin provoked philosophers by saying that you could have a perfectly rational and reasonable and justified belief in God without any evidence. Now, there are some twists and turns in that, but Reformed epistemology has had an enormous amount of influence. So those are a few important books, and when you come to more recent stuff, there's so many books and many people involved that it's hard to count them. But we live in a great day. I honestly mean this. A great day for Christian philosophy. I think the only period of Christian philosophy that you could compare it with would be the High Middle Ages, the days of Anselm and Aquinas and Duns Scotus and all those. Whether they were contributing as much as people have been recently, I have there's no way to judge that, okay? But I think we live in a true golden era of Christian philosophy, and we need to make the most of our opportunities. So that's a quickie there.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Hasker. A couple more questions. One, what are your daily habits like? Maybe thinking about like your spiritual formation or like your philosophical output, because you've put out a lot of philosophical work.
Yeah,
What are some of the habits that have helped you?
of course, I'm retired. I retired a long time ago, actually, 2000. But I continue doing philosophical work. But each morning, I have you might say, a quiet time. I write out, you might say, a prayer for the day, which is sort of my thoughts before God about where I am and where I'm going on this day. The benefit of writing it is just a short paragraph usually, but benefit of writing a prayer is that it fixes something in a more definite way. I mean, thoughts run through your mind so quickly, and even prayers can run through your mind quickly. But writing something out has a benefit, and then I will read a portion of scripture. Right now, I'm reading the Gospel of Matthew, and pray about this, and maybe pray about some other people that I care about and have needs, and so on. So this is sort of the focus, my spiritual focus for that time each day. Often I will spend time in the morning doing philosophical work, and maybe going into the afternoon. I find I can't work on philosophy all day and then be good for anything the next day. You know, I have to, in a sense, limit the time I spend on it. But I think I work fairly rapidly. I think this has always been true all my life. So I spend a number of hours. My church activities are not that major at this point for a number of reasons. I find going to church and participating in a service surprisingly tiring. I don't want to think about why that is, but it is the case. So I don't attend every Sunday even, but I do have a church that I attend, and I respect the minister very much and get a lot out of the service when I do attend. Then I'm, of course, in touch with a lot of people, keep in touch with people who have philosophical concerns, who have Christian concerns in common with me. Other than that, what do I do? Well, I do some yard work. I do need to mow the lawn. I work out some at the YMCA, so I keep going. Okay, keep busy, but that's a little bit of an answer to your question, I guess.
Yeah, that's super helpful. One more question, Dr. Hasker. What advice would you give to people who want to grow, to people listening to this, and maybe they want to pursue philosophy or just they want to just grow as a Christian? Like, what advice would you give to those people?
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think you need to be really honest with yourself and honest with God. That is, when you are praying, when you're talking to God, you need to lay it all out. Don't be pretending. And of course, to be completely honest, is a difficult thing. I mean, how do you do that? Well, you keep finding out more about yourself, and challenges that you meet in your life keep forcing you to grow. And I think if you work hard to be in contact with God, and this involves, of course, prayer and reading the scriptures, God will lead you into situations that enable you to grow and require you to grow. Now, in philosophy, of course, there's an enormous amount of good philosophical work being done, and quite a fair bit of material that is coming out that is accessible to people who are not professional philosophers. One of the problems with professional philosophy is that a lot of it is done, a lot of the writing that is done in such a way that it's mainly useful to other philosophers, professional philosophers, or graduate students in philosophy and so on. And that of course that can be valuable for advancing the field, advancing the discipline, but it doesn't have a great effect on society in general. So it's important that there should be writing, philosophical writing, that is broadly accessible. And I hope your apologetic series is another manifestation of this. And so there is a lot of material that people can get at and read and think about, hopefully talk about with other people, that is accessible without a lot of advanced training in philosophy. And of course, these internet services like yours have a role to play too. I've sometimes thought that the internet is something like the forum in ancient Athens. You know, Socrates went out there, and people came around and asked him questions, and he talked with them. And of course, there were lots of other people doing this too. But it was out there for people who were curious, and Athenian philosophy became the glory of the ancient world. Well, the internet is our Athenian forum, and anybody can come there. Pretty much anybody can set up a website and have their say about things, and hopefully it leads to enlightenment and understanding. It certainly is an opportunity for people who want to develop their thinking. So that's quickly.
Well, Dr. Hasker, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing some of like the insights that you've learned, and the wisdom and everything. There's so much that like I'm going to take away from this. So I'm sure for people who've listened to this, I'm sure the same. So thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate your time and your willingness to share as always. You're awesome.
All right. Thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good one and God bless. We'll catch you later.